I am coming out of retirement to say one thing. Do not sleep on the telepathy tapes. And if you're not sleeping on telepathy tapes, I have an excellent follow-up book that you can read. So if you don't know about this phenomenon podcast that went really hot last year, I think it's one of the most moving and beautiful things I've seen in a long time, as well as inspirational. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I've been reading a lot about the supernormal these past 5 years or so, and I have a general sense of what's out there. But this blew me away. And if you don't know the story, it is a bunch of kids who are autistic to the point of usually being nonverbal. But it turns out, as they work with their parents and this scientist who believes them and will test them, it turns out that they have telepathic abilities that are fantastic. Some of these kids can just very reliably read people's minds. Sometimes a lot of people, sometimes just their loved one. And in the show, they do controlled experiments to prove that this is happening. And it is fantastic. Apparently they meet at a place called the Hill, where there are hundreds or thousands of souls there, and it is somewhere in the other world. And it's just real life superpowers. And it's also so inspirational because some of these kids were locked in. They had parents who would not give up on them and would not listen to the common dogma that there's nobody in there. And instead, they finally found a way to talk to the kids, sometimes with a tool where you point at a letter and then they can talk. But now there's more digital tools as well. But they find that not only is there a kid in there, these kids are geniuses. They know other languages that they've never heard. They can see things going on medically with people. The stories get even more far out there as the show goes on, and I don't want to ruin that for you because it is fantastic and sends shivers up your spine. And the other thing I want to say is, to you critics at The Guardian and at Vice, shame on you. Shame on you. That is in your White Tower refusal to look at the evidence and just shit on all of the work that these kids and the people working with them have gone through, bending over backwards to prove that nobody's cheating here in these experiments, and to not have done the research. This is just the culmination of 100 years of evidence. If you go back to Myers and the Society for Psychical Research, all of this stuff is in there. It's usually not at this high level and provability, but there is science behind all of this that goes back a century. And all you have to do is go read it. There's nothing here that is outside the bounds of what I've seen before. It's simply perhaps a more distilled and purified version of it. But to shit on what they're doing like that and to just brush it away is shameful. I thought that was really shameful, those articles. So anyway, the last thing I'll say about that is I would love to go to the Hill. I have spent my entire life dreaming about connections like this. And when you ask what kind of superpowers you would want, I don't need any superpowers. My superpower would be wanting to be a better parent and have better patience with my kid and with my partner. But the ability to communicate with these other entities at the Hill, I sit at this bed. Yes, I now have a bed in my office. It's wonderful. That's where I'm working on my Western Canon project. To sit there, and I sit there sometimes now, and I just try to open my mind to it being there. If anybody out there is on the Hill and wants to try to connect to someone like me, I am curious and I am open. So the follow-up book that you can read if this interests you is 30 Years Among the Dead by Dr. Carl Wickland. And this was a medical doctor who was also a spiritualist. And he would run into these patients with psychiatric conditions, and they felt like they were coming from outside the patient. And eventually, working with his wife, who happened to be a medium, he could get these spirits of dead people who were inhabiting his patients to come out of them, go into his wife, and then he could talk to these souls who most of the time did not realize they were dead. They were just confused. They died quickly. They had unfinished business, and they would inhabit people and try to do their own business. Sometimes that's just to get a drink or to harm themselves, or sometimes things more prosaic but would be odd for the person. And so he helped so many of his patients because it wasn't them that was causing them to do these bad behaviors. It was dead souls who would sometimes take over their bodies. And for proof, there were a lot of cases where they would get information about an incident that happened maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago, and they would go look it up and find it in the newspapers of that time and everything the spirit said. And oftentimes it was happy endings. He would somewhat brusquely say, "No, you're dead. Look around. Like, look at your hands. You shouldn't have women's hands like this. What year do you think it is?" And eventually the dead soul would realize it. And as soon as they did, they would look around and they would see someone they cared about, like their mother, being like, "Hey, I'm here. I've been here the whole time. Just come to me," and other kinds of guardian spirits. And then they would, as soon as they realized what was happening, they could be released from where they were and continue their transition to whatever that is. And it was a really fascinating book, and it's even more fascinating that it continues until this day. If you know about the hot therapeutic method called internal family systems, where you treat the parts inside of yourself like a big family that, you need to work with. There is something in there, a new book about unattached burdens, they call them, which is basically, they called them unattached burdens because they didn't want to call them demonic entities, but that's basically what they meant. The founder of the practice, Dick Schwartz, has endorsed this book about unattached burdens, and that sometimes it's not actually parts of you, it's parts from outside of you, and you need to do almost like a scientific version of an exorcism to get rid of that part. And so this work still continues unto this day. And so all of this to me is just fascinating and inspirational. And as I just read in a quote from Myers, as humans go forward, we keep finding more and more worlds. At first, we thought, oh, we have this continent, but then it turns out we have the whole planet. And then we learn more about science, and it's like, oh no, there's this whole other universe of stars. And we keep getting our minds bigger and bigger as we learn more. And that is probably where this next level of spirituality goes. There is so much more happening. And there are many centuries of very smart people talking about what's going on here. And we're learning to access it more and more. And these kids on the hill could be a way to help take humanity to a kinder, better future. So thank you for everyone who's been pushing this work forward and for what you do.